On November 22nd, 1963, a volley of shots in Dallas not only killed President John F. Kennedy, but also extinguished an era of American hope. That event, unfolding in just 6 devastating seconds, became one of the deepest and most enduring psychological traumas in the nation's modern history. It was more than an assassination. It was a watershed, a moment when America's post-war innocence seemed to shatter forever. Many researchers argue that the assassination was the culmination of a broader political firestorm, not merely the act of a lone individual. To truly understand why he died, we must peel back the layers of myth woven around him to see the complex man within, the powerful enemies he confronted, and the shadowy forces he dared to challenge. Although the Warren Commission reached a definitive conclusion that a single gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, was the sole perpetrator, for many Americans, the case still feels unresolved. It is a tragedy that forever changed America, pushing the nation into a shadow of mistrust and paving the way for some of the darkest chapters in its history. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born not just into a family, but into a dynasty. The Kennedys were America's unofficial royalty, a clan forged by the fierce will and ambition of its patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy. Senior Joe Kennedy was a larger-than-life figure, a third-generation Irish-American who overcame deep-seated prejudice to amass a colossal fortune from the stock market, alleged bootlegging, real estate, and the film industry. But money was never enough. As an Irish Catholic, he forever felt like an outsider to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant WASP establishment that dominated America's corridors of power. His ultimate dream was not for himself. His path was blocked after his controversial tenure as ambassador to the United Kingdom, where he advocated for appeasing Hitler, but for his sons. He raised his 9 children with an iron discipline and an unforgiving expectation to win. "We don't want any losers around here," he often said. For the Kennedys, second place was failure. His dream was that one of his sons would break that final barrier and enter the White House, thereby cementing the Kennedy clan's place at the apex of American society. But fate intervened cruelly. During World War II, both brothers served with valor. Jack became a hero after the PT-19 incident, but it was Joe Jr.'s heroic act that cost him his life. In August 1944, Joe Jr. volunteered for a top-secret and extremely dangerous bombing mission called Operation Aphrodite. He was to pilot a bomber packed with explosives, intending to bail out before remotely crashing it into a Nazi fortification. But the plane exploded prematurely over the English sky, killing him instantly. Joe Jr.'s death shook the Kennedy family to its core, but for the father, grief was inseparable from ambition. The dream did not die, it was merely transferred. The heavy mantle of destiny, intended for Joe Jr., now passed to the second son, Jack. From that moment on, John F. Kennedy's life was no longer entirely his own. He carried on his shoulders not only his own hopes, but also the unfulfilled legacy of his fallen brother and the unyielding dream of his father. From the outside, Jack Kennedy seemed blessed. He had wealth, charm, a sharp intellect, and the handsome looks of a movie star. But behind that image was a starkly different reality. Kennedy was a man who lived in the shadow of death and in constant, debilitating pain. He was a sickly child, tormented by a litany of illnesses from scarlet fever, appendicitis, and jaundice to chronic infections. The most serious and most closely guarded secret was Addison's disease, a rare and potentially fatal adrenal gland disorder. The disease weakens the body's ability to cope with stress, infection, and injury. And before hormone replacement therapy, it was virtually a death sentence. Kennedy was diagnosed in the late 1940s and depended on daily corticosteroid injections for the rest of his life just to stay alive. Yet it is against this backdrop of fragility that the story of his courage becomes all the more extraordinary. On the night of August 2nd, 1943, the patrol torpedo boat he commanded, PT-109, was rammed and sliced in two by a Japanese destroyer in the South Pacific. Kennedy was thrown into the sea. Despite a severe back injury, he gathered the survivors and led them on a nearly 3-mile swim to a nearby deserted island, clenching the life jacket strap of a badly burned crewmate in his teeth and towing him along. For nearly a week, he risked his life swimming into dangerous straits to find help, until they were finally discovered by 2 native islanders and rescued. After 3 unremarkable terms in the House of Representatives, Kennedy set his sights higher. In 1952, he challenged the popular incumbent Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. for a Senate seat. It was an uphill battle, a clash between 2 of Massachusetts' most prominent political families. Once again, the Kennedy political machine went into overdrive. His mother and sisters hosted the famous tea parties across the state, and Kennedy outmaneuvered his rival in a narrow victory, even as the Republican presidential candidate, Dwight D. Eisenhower, won the state in a landslide. In the Senate, Kennedy continued to build his profile, particularly on foreign affairs. He served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and traveled widely, developing a sophisticated worldview on the Cold War. In 1957, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book Profiles in Courage, a collection of stories about U.S. senators who defied party and public pressure to vote their conscience. Although questions would later be raised about the extent to which Kennedy himself wrote the book, his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, was a key collaborator. It significantly burnished his credentials as a statesman of substance and intellect. By 1960, Jack Kennedy was ready for the ultimate prize. He announced his candidacy for president, a move many in the Democratic Party saw as audacious and premature. He faced a slate of more established rivals in the primaries, including Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas. His biggest challenge was religion. America had never elected a Catholic president, and many Protestants, especially in the South and Midwest, feared a Catholic president would take orders from the Pope in Rome. Kennedy confronted the issue head-on. In the crucial West Virginia primary, a heavily Protestant state, he spoke candidly about his faith and his absolute allegiance to the U.S. Constitution. His decisive victory there proved a Catholic could win. Later, in a landmark speech to a group of Protestant ministers in Houston, he declared his belief in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. He had successfully neutralized his opponent's most potent weapon. After securing the Democratic nomination, he chose his chief rival, Lyndon Johnson, as his running mate, a masterful political move to unite the party and secure the South. His opponent in the general election was the incumbent Vice President Richard Nixon, a seasoned politician and a fierce anti-communist. The 1960 election was one of the closest in American history. Kennedy won by a margin of just over 100,000 popular votes nationwide. There were persistent allegations of voter fraud in key states like Illinois, where Chicago Mayor Richard Daley controlled the political machine, and Texas, but Nixon chose not to challenge the results for the good of the country. At 43, John F. Kennedy became the youngest man ever elected president and the first Catholic to achieve it. Joe Kennedy's dream had finally come true. The Kennedy White House became a center of intellectual and artistic excellence. They invited poets, musicians, scientists, and Nobel laureates to dinners, creating an atmosphere where culture and power intersected. Kennedy's inaugural address, with its idealistic call to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, inspired a generation of young people to enter public service. He established the Peace Corps, sending young American volunteers around the world, and set a bold goal of landing an American on the moon by the end of the decade. It was a time of boundless optimism, a sense that with energy, intelligence, and will, there was no problem America could not solve. But Camelot, like its namesake, was as much a carefully constructed myth as it was a reality. Behind closed doors, the image of a perfect family concealed more complicated truths. The Kennedy marriage was rocked by his infidelities, and his fragile health remained a closely guarded secret. His administration, dubbed the best and the brightest, could at times be arrogant and made critical missteps, particularly in foreign policy. The myth of Camelot, largely solidified after his tragic death, tends to obscure the complexity and the difficult decisions of a presidency that confronted some of the most perilous moments of the Cold War. It was in those decisions, in the confrontations with powerful forces at home and abroad, that the seeds of the tragedy in Dallas were sown. John F. Kennedy's presidency, though shrouded in the glow of Camelot, was no fairy tale. He took office at one of the most dangerous moments in human history, the height of the Cold War, when the world's two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, faced each other across a fragile ideological line, armed with nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization. His inaugural address, with its promise to pay any price, bear any burden, to assure the survival and the success of liberty, set a standard of assertive interventionism. However, the reality of governing forced the young president to confront a world far more complex than soaring rhetoric. His approach, an intricate dance between confrontation and conciliation, between covert action and public diplomacy, ultimately made him enemies of powerful and entrenched forces on all sides of the political spectrum. He challenged long-standing power structures, questioned sacrosanct assumptions, and tried to steer the ship of state off the dangerous courses charted by his predecessors. In the process, he created a growing list of influential foes who saw his policies not just as mistaken, but as a dangerous betrayal of American interests. To understand the tragedy in Dallas, we must first understand this gathering storm of anger and resentment from those who believed the president was leading the nation to the abyss. Kennedy's first and perhaps most bitter powerful enemy emerged from within his own government, the Central Intelligence Agency. When Kennedy took office, the CIA was at the zenith of its power and prestige. Led by the legendary director Allen Dulles, a master of clandestine operations and one of the architects of the Cold War intelligence community, the CIA was accustomed to operating in the shadows with a remarkable degree of autonomy. They had orchestrated successful coups in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954, toppling democratically elected governments they deemed too friendly to the communist bloc. Under President Eisenhower, Dulles and his ambitious deputy director for plans, Richard Bissell, had grown used to receiving tacit approval for their most audacious operations. The Bay of Pigs was a total humiliation for the Kennedy administration and the United States on the world stage. Publicly, Kennedy took full responsibility, but privately, he was furious. Feeling foolish and profoundly betrayed by his own advisors. He believed the CIA had deceived him, locking him into a poorly designed plan and then trying to corner him into a military intervention. The fallout was swift. Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, his deputy Richard Bissell, and another top official, Charles Cabell. The firing of Dulles, an icon of the intelligence community, sent shockwaves through the agency. For many hardline CIA officers who had dedicated their careers to secret wars, Kennedy had committed an unforgivable sin. First, he had shown weakness and indecision by refusing to commit the full might of America. Second, and worse, he had not stood by his men. He abandoned the exiles on the beach and then blamed the agency by firing its leaders. Kennedy's mistrust of his military advisors, sparked by the Bay of Pigs, grew into a full-blown confrontation during the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, in October 1962. When American U-2 spy planes discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, capable of striking most major U.S. cities, the world held its breath. Their solution was simple and brutal: immediate surgical airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba by U.S. forces. For LeMay, who had commanded the firebombing of Japan in World War II, anything less was dangerous appeasement, a repeat of the weakness he saw at the Bay of Pigs. In a fiery confrontation in the cabinet room, LeMay bluntly told the president that a blockade of the island, the solution Kennedy was leaning toward, was a weak response. He compared it to the British policy of appeasement toward Hitler at Munich. "This is almost as bad as treason," he reportedly said. But Kennedy, haunted by the bad advice he had received a year and a half earlier, resisted the military pressure. He recognized what the generals seemingly did not. An attack on Cuba would almost certainly lead to a Soviet reprisal, possibly against U.S. forces in Berlin, and from there, escalate rapidly into a full-scale nuclear war that would kill hundreds of millions. He chose a middle path, a naval quarantine, as he diplomatically called it, to prevent further military shipments to Cuba, while opening a secret back channel of communication with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. In the end, Kennedy's strategy worked. After 13 days of heart-stopping tension, a deal was struck. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and in return, Kennedy publicly pledged not to invade the island. Additionally, in a secret side deal, Kennedy agreed to remove obsolete American Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date. The world breathed a sigh of relief, but at the Pentagon, there was a sense of fury and betrayal. The generals believed they had been on the verge of total victory. They believed Kennedy had blinked, that he had made concessions to the Soviets by giving up the right to invade Cuba and secretly trading away the missiles in Turkey. To them, Kennedy was not a wise statesman who had saved the world, but a weak and inexperienced leader who had been duped by the communists and had refused the chance to eliminate Castro once and for all. The rift between Kennedy and his military leadership deepened. It was evident in their opposition to the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which they saw as a dangerous handicap to American weapons development. It was also manifest in a shocking document declassified years later, Operation Northwoods. This was a 1962 proposal from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in which they suggested staging a series of false flag terrorist attacks, including blowing up American ships, attacking U.S. bases, and shooting down civilian airliners, and blaming them on Cuba to create a pretext for war. Kennedy rejected the plan outright. In every version of the story of November 22, 1963, whether the official narrative or any of the myriad conspiracy theories, all roads eventually lead to one man, Lee Harvey Oswald. To the Warren Commission, he was a disturbed loner, a disgruntled Marxist who acted on his own twisted impulses to find a place in history. To the skeptics, he was the patsy, an intricate pawn in a deadly game, a figure carefully managed and manipulated to take the fall for a crime he did not commit, or at least did not commit alone. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, on October 18, 1939. Tragedy shadowed his life before it even began. His father, Robert Edward Lee Oswald, an insurance premium collector, died of a sudden heart attack 2 months before Lee was born. The death of his father plunged the family into financial precarity and a life of constant nomadism. His mother, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, was a complex, domineering, and perpetually victimized figure. She struggled to raise her 3 sons, Lee, his older half-brother John Pick, and his full brother Robert Oswald, on a series of low-paying jobs. She was always seeking stability but never seemed able to hold on to it. In Lee's first 17 years, the family moved more than 20 times, living in New Orleans, Dallas, Fort Worth, and New York. Lee was rarely in one school long enough to form lasting friendships. The absence of a father figure and a stable home life left deep scars. Lee was an introverted, troubled, and frequently truant child. He was a voracious reader, drawn to books on history and politics, but he struggled to connect with those around him. His brothers would later describe him as quick-tempered, prone to isolating himself and living in a fantasy world of his own. In his testimony before the Warren Commission, Lee's brother Robert summarized the essence of his younger brother profoundly. "In my opinion," Lee Harvey Oswald was a loner looking for a stage. Oswald's entire life can be seen as a restless search for that stage, a place where he, a man who felt invisible and unimportant, could finally play a leading role. At 17, desperate to escape his chaotic home life and find some kind of structure, Oswald dropped out of high school and joined the U.S. Marine Corps in 1956. On the surface, it seemed like a positive change. The Marines, with their strict discipline and emphasis on conformity, could have provided the stability he never had. In some respects, he succeeded. He was trained as a radar operator and passed his proficiency tests with ease. Most notably, he proved to be a skilled marksman. In December 1956, he scored 212 on a rifle range test, slightly above the requirement for the rank of sharpshooter, the second highest classification in the Marines. Although his score later dropped in 1959 to just barely qualify for the lowest rank, marksman, his ability with a rifle was established. His rebellion was not just intellectual. His discipline began to fray. He was court-martialed twice. The first time was for possessing an unauthorized private handgun. The second, and more serious, was for fighting with a sergeant he believed had treated him unfairly. These infractions led to his being demoted from private first class to private and spending time in the brig. The once promising Marine was now a troublemaker. Oswald's life in the Marines was a bundle of contradictions. He was both a competent soldier, a skilled shot, and an undisciplined rebel. He served in an elite anti-communist organization while secretly flirting with the ideology of the enemy. The experience did not seem to give him the structure he sought, but rather deepened his sense of alienation and antagonism toward authority. He had found a new ideology, Marxism, which gave his personal feelings of discontent a political framework. He was no longer just a loner. He was a potential revolutionary, and he was about to make a dramatic move that would put his newfound beliefs to the ultimate test. In 1959, after securing an early hardship discharge on the largely fabricated grounds that he needed to care for his ailing mother, Oswald took the most decisive step of his life thus far. He had saved a small amount of money, obtained a passport, and embarked on a circuitous journey through Europe, eventually arriving in Helsinki, Finland. There, he walked into the Soviet embassy and declared his intention to renounce his American citizenship and defect to the USSR. In a shocking move at the height of the Cold War, he arrived in Moscow. At the U.S. Embassy, he met with Consul Richard Snyder and dramatically declared he wished to renounce his citizenship. He proclaimed himself a Marxist and told Snyder he had offered to give the Soviets the radar secrets he had learned in the Marines. It was an apparent act of treason, a total rejection of his country, but his grand gesture quickly fizzled. The Soviets, ever suspicious, didn't know what to make of this strange defector. They suspected he might be an American spy. Initially, they rejected his request for asylum. Faced with the prospect of being deported, a desperate Oswald slashed his wrist in his hotel bathtub, a half-hearted suicide attempt, but dramatic enough to force the authorities to reconsider. Instead of welcoming him as a communist hero, the Soviets sent him to Minsk, an industrial city in Belarus, and gave him a job in a radio and television factory. They provided him with a relatively comfortable apartment by Soviet standards and a small stipend. For a short time, Oswald seemed to have found his paradise. He was treated as someone special, and he enjoyed the life of a minor celebrity expatriate. During his time in Minsk, he met and married Marina Prusakova, a young Russian woman. They had a daughter together, June, but even marriage couldn't quell his restlessness. By 1961, the once ardent defector had done a complete turnaround. A disillusioned Oswald began writing to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, asking to come home. Incredibly, the U.S. government agreed. Despite his earlier threats of treason, the State Department treated his defection as a youthful impulse. They reissued his and Marina's passports and even gave him a loan for their passage. In June 1962, Lee Harvey Oswald, along with his Russian wife and infant daughter, returned to the United States, a man without a country, a reject of both superpowers. His search for a stage had ended in failure. Back in the United States, Oswald was a man more isolated than ever. He drifted with his family between Dallas and Fort Worth, working a series of menial jobs, a welder, a photo processor, but never holding one for long. His marriage was volatile, marked by intense arguments and at times physical violence. He also tried to find a place for himself in the great ideological struggle of the age, but his political activities became increasingly bizarre and contradictory. In the summer of 1963, after moving his family to his native New Orleans, he suddenly became a public pro-Fidel Castro activist. He single-handedly formed a one-man chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, FPCC, a pro-Castro organization based in New York. He printed leaflets on which he listed the address of a company where he didn't even work. He tried to infiltrate an anti-Castro exile group, possibly to gather intelligence. This activity culminated in August 1963. Oswald staged a well-publicized street scuffle with a group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles led by Carlos Bringuier. The incident, likely calculated by Oswald to get attention, led to his brief arrest. He then used the arrest to get himself on a local radio debate program, where he clumsily defended the Castro regime against his opponents. In April 1963, before his move to New Orleans, Oswald allegedly committed his first act of political violence. According to the Warren Commission, he used his mail-order rifle, an Italian Mannlicher Carcano, to take a shot at General Edwin Walker, a prominent far-right figure and rabid anti-communist who had been dismissed from the army for distributing political literature to his troops. The shot was fired through Walker's home window, but narrowly missed his head. At the time, Dallas police had no suspects. It was only after the Kennedy assassination that Marina Oswald revealed her husband had confessed the attack to her. The incident, if true, demonstrated that Oswald was capable and willing to commit political assassination, but the choice of target, a far-right figure, was puzzling for a supposed Marxist. His behavior was described by consular officials as erratic, rude, and desperate. He claimed to be a friend of the Cuban Revolution and a communist, but the Cubans, like the Soviets years earlier, were suspicious. They refused to grant him a visa without prior Soviet approval, and the Soviets would not cooperate. After days of fruitless attempts, a furious Oswald returned to Dallas. What Oswald did not know was that both of these embassies were under intense surveillance by the CIA's Mexico City station, one of the agency's largest and most important. The CIA had cameras photographing everyone who entered and left, and they had wiretaps recording phone calls. They were well aware of Oswald's presence there. The official Warren Commission story treats this trip as just another chapter in the life of a confused loner. But later declassified documents have revealed a much more complex and disturbing story. The CIA's files on Oswald's Mexico City trip are riddled with contradictions, missing information, and anomalies. There are surveillance photos of a man identified as Oswald, who is clearly not him. There are tape recordings of calls supposedly made by Oswald that were made by someone with a different voice. The files suggest the CIA knew much more about Oswald's activities. Upon his return to Dallas in early October, Oswald seemed a man who had run out of options. He had tried to be a revolutionary on both sides of the Iron Curtain and had failed. He reunited tenuously with Marina, who was now pregnant with their second child, and moved into a rooming house in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. He needed a job. Through a neighbor, he heard about an opening at a downtown book warehouse. On October 16, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald began his new job as a $1.25 an hour order filler at the Texas School Book Depository. From the windows of its sixth floor, there was a perfect, unobstructed view of Dealey Plaza, the endpoint of a presidential motorcade route that would be announced in the Dallas papers just a few weeks later. All the pieces, whether by accident or by design, were now in place. A popular but controversial president, surrounded by powerful enemies, a city seething with political hatred, and a troubled, enigmatic loner, a man with a rifle and a history of violence, now working in a building that was about to become the world's most infamous crime scene. The stage was set. All of these forces, the simmering resentment of the underworld, the suspicion of the intelligence community, the belligerence of the Pentagon, and the inscrutable desperation of a lone outcast were converging on a single point on the map: Dallas, Texas. In 1963, Dallas was not just a booming southern economic hub, it was a hotbed of political extremism. The city was a bastion of the far right where anti-Kennedy, anti-Catholic, and anti-federal government sentiment ran open and venomous. A month before the president's visit, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, had been jeered, jostled, and hit on the head with a protest sign. Dallas was described by Texas Governor John Connally himself as a city of hate and extremism. Against this tense backdrop, President Kennedy's trip to Texas had an urgent political purpose. The main goal was to heal a deep rift within the state's Democratic Party between the liberal faction, led by Senator Ralph Yarborough, and the conservative wing, headed by Governor Connally, a Johnson protege. Unity was crucial if Kennedy was to carry Texas in his 1964 re-election campaign. The two-day, five-city tour was designed as a charm offensive, a chance for the president and the enormously popular First Lady to showcase their charisma and raise campaign funds. No one could have known it would become a journey into darkness. As the sun rose on the morning of Friday, November 22nd, 1963, it illuminated a city holding its breath. For most, it was a day of excitement, a chance to catch a glimpse of the handsome young president and his glamorous wife. But for others, hidden in the shadows, it was the culmination of a long and patient wait. This is the story of that day, a moment-by-moment chronicle of the final hours of Camelot and the 6 seconds that would break a nation's heart. When the door of Air Force One opened at 11:38 a.m., the Kennedys were greeted by a blast of bright Texas sunshine and a wave of sound. The crowd at Love Field was huge, much larger than anyone had expected. Thousands of people pressed against the fences, cheering, waving signs, and chanting, JFK. All the talk of Dallas being a city of hate seemed to dissolve in the face of this warm welcome. Jackie was presented with a bouquet of brilliant red roses, which she cradled in her arms. The president was clearly energized, his face lit up with his famous 1,000-watt smile. At 11:50 a.m., the motorcade departed from Love Field. The president and Mrs. Kennedy sat in the back seat. In the jump seats directly in front of them were Governor Connally and his wife Nellie. The route was a 10-mile ribbon through the heart of Dallas, designed to give as many people as possible a chance to see the president. The crowds lining the streets, Main Street, Harwood Street, were dense and enthusiastic. It was a rolling festival, a parade of American optimism. As the motorcade moved, Nellie Connally turned around and said to the president a phrase that would become forever haunting. "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy smiled and replied, "No, you certainly can't." They were the last words most would ever hear him speak. At approximately 12:29 p.m., the presidential motorcade made a sharp left turn from Main Street onto Houston Street, and then a wider 120-degree left turn onto Elm Street. This turn slowed the limousine to about 11 miles per hour. As it straightened out on Elm Street, it entered what military strategists would call a perfect kill zone. What happened next took place in approximately 6 seconds. Those 6 seconds have been analyzed, dissected, and debated more than any other moment in American history. They were recorded accidentally and tragically by a Dallas dress manufacturer named Abraham Zapruder, who was standing on a concrete pedestal with his 8mm Bell & Howell movie camera. His 486 frames of silent color film would become the most important and haunting forensic document of the 20th century. At approximately 12:30 p.m., a sharp cracking sound echoed through Dealey Plaza. On the film, we see a brief startled reaction from some in the crowd. A little girl running on the grass suddenly stops and looks toward the book depository. But in the limousine, nothing seems to change. Kennedy continues to wave. Jackie has no reaction. Governor Connally, an experienced hunter, turns his head slightly to his rear, recognizing the sound as a rifle shot. Most people, including many law enforcement officers, would later say they dismissed the sound as a firecracker or a motorcycle backfiring. We now know that this shot, according to the Warren Commission's conclusion, missed the car entirely. It is believed to have struck the curb on the far side of Elm Street, sending a chip of concrete flying that grazed the cheek of a bystander named James Tague, who was standing near the triple underpass. It was the first physical evidence that something was wrong, but in the chaos, it went unnoticed. About 3.5 seconds after the first noise, an astonishingly long time in an assassination, the second shot was fired. According to the Warren Commission's reconstruction, a single bullet fired from behind entered his upper back and exited through his throat. The exit wound at the front of his throat, just below the Adam's apple, was obscured at Parkland Hospital by a tracheotomy, causing initial confusion about whether he had been shot from the front. This is the shot that would become the linchpin of the Warren Commission's case, the controversial single bullet or magic bullet. They concluded that this same bullet, after passing through Kennedy's neck, continued its trajectory and caused all of Governor Connolly's wounds. On the film, just after Kennedy is hit, we see Connolly's body stiffen, his cheeks puff out, and his mouth open as he shouts, "My God, they are going to kill us all." He then slumps into the lap of his wife, Nellie. His right lung collapsed, a rib shattered, his right wrist fractured, and a piece of the bullet lodged in his left thigh. For the next horrifying 5 seconds, the limousine continued to glide forward, a rolling stage of unfolding horror. Jackie, confused, turned to her husband, a look of bewilderment on her face. She still did not understand what was happening. "Jack, Jack," she was reported to have said. The Secret Service driver, William Greer, had heard the noises, but seemed not to grasp their origin or meaning. In fact, he slowed the car down even further, from about 11 miles per hour to around 8. The force of the impact was so great that it threw his body backward and to the left, slamming him against the back of the seat. This back and to the left motion has become a cornerstone of conspiracy theories, cited by critics as irrefutable proof of a shot fired from the front, from the grassy knoll. However, forensic experts have argued that the motion could have been the result of a massive neuromuscular spasm or a jet effect from the explosive exit wound at the front of the head. In that moment of pure horror, Jacqueline Kennedy reacted with primal instinct. As her husband's lifeless body collapsed toward her, she crawled out of her seat and onto the flat trunk of the moving car. For years, her action was widely misinterpreted as an attempt to escape, but she later testified, and Clint Hill confirmed, that she was reaching for a piece of her husband's skull that had landed there. It was a moment of grief, shock, and a hopeless attempt to hold on to what had been destroyed. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, riding on the running board of the follow-up car, was the day's singular hero. Hearing the first shot, he had jumped off and was sprinting toward the presidential limousine. He reached the car just after the headshot, leaped onto the back, and pushed the stunned Mrs. Kennedy back into her seat, shielding her and the president's body with his own, as the driver, Greer, finally grasped the horror and hit the accelerator, speeding the car under the triple underpass and out of Dealey Plaza. The 6-minute ride to Parkland Memorial Hospital was a blur of horror, disbelief, and blood. In the back of the car, Jackie cradled her husband's shattered head in her lap, her whispered words lost to the screaming siren. "Jack, Jack, can you hear me? I love you," she said over and over. "What have they done to you?" Governor Connolly lay on the floor of the car, grievously wounded but conscious, his wife Nellie shielding him with her body. When the limousine screeched to a halt at the emergency room entrance, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses, alerted by police radio that the president had been shot, were waiting. They gently lifted Kennedy onto a gurney and wheeled him into Trauma Room 1, a tiny space that was about to become the center of the world. The medical team that worked on him, led by Dr. Charles Carrico, a young resident, and later Dr. Malcolm Perry, a vascular surgeon, faced a hopeless situation. His throat wound, had it been the only injury, might have been survivable. But the head wound, as one doctor would later describe it, was a mortal wound. There was a massive hole in the back right side of his head, and a significant portion of his cerebellum was gone. It was clear he had suffered an unsurvivable brain injury. Still, they fought. They performed a tracheotomy through the throat wound to try to establish an airway. They administered blood and fluids and performed external cardiac massage, but there was no response, no heartbeat, no breath. In the chaos, Father Oscar Huber was summoned to perform the last rites of the Catholic Church. At exactly 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, some 30 minutes after the shots were fired, after consulting with the president's personal physician, Admiral George Berkeley, who had traveled with them, the doctors ceased their resuscitation efforts. Dr. William Kemp Clark, the chief of neurosurgery, performed a final examination and pronounced the inevitable. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was dead. In a small room nearby, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, surrounded by a thick detail of Secret Service agents, who now treated him as the new Commander-in-Chief, received the news. The transfer of power, born of a moment of unspeakable violence, had begun. America had a new president, while the body of his predecessor still lay on an emergency room table. The world had changed forever in those 6 seconds in Dealey Plaza. But for Lee Harvey Oswald, his day's work was not yet done. While the world's attention was fixed on the limousine speeding frantically toward Parkland Hospital, another, quieter, but no less crucial drama began to unfold. In the chaos that engulfed Dealey Plaza, amid the screams, sirens, and utter confusion, a ghost slipped away from the scene of his own crime. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man on the 6th floor, had begun a brief and desperate flight, a journey that would spread more death and ultimately lead to his own capture. His actions in the minutes and hours after the assassination are a study in a strange, unsettling calm mixed with violent panic. According to the official Warren Commission timeline, meticulously pieced together from witness testimony and physical evidence, Oswald's movements trace the path of a methodical but increasingly cornered fugitive. For those who believe the official story, these actions are clear proof of his guilt. For critics, they are another baffling chain of events, full of unanswered questions and strange coincidences that suggest an unseen guiding hand. This is the chronicle of Oswald's final hours as a free man, a cat-and-mouse chase through a city sinking into shock and horror. At 12:30 p.m., the fatal shot was fired. On the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, a sniper's nest had been deliberately constructed. 3 spent shell casings were later found near the southeast window, shielded from view by carefully arranged stacks of book cartons. According to the Warren Commission, after firing his final shot, Oswald quickly walked across the floor, hid his Mannlicher Carcano rifle between other stacks of cartons in the northwest corner of the building, and descended the rear staircase. Time was of the essence. A mere 90 seconds after the shots, at approximately 12:31:30, a fateful encounter occurred. Dallas police officer Marion Baker, who had been riding a motorcycle in the motorcade, immediately stopped his bike when he heard the shots. Believing the shots came from the book depository, he raced into the building with his pistol drawn. He was accompanied by the building superintendent, Roy Truly, who offered to help. As they hurried up the stairs, Baker spotted a man calmly walking down on the 2nd floor landing. That man was Lee Harvey Oswald. Baker pointed his gun at Oswald and ordered him to stop. It was a moment of supreme tension, but Truly, recognizing Oswald, calmly told the officer, "This boy works here. He's okay." Baker, satisfied with the explanation, lowered his gun and continued up the stairs toward the roof, leaving Oswald behind. It was the first and arguably most critical near miss of the manhunt. The alleged presidential assassin had come face to face with the law just seconds after the crime and had walked away without even being asked his name. To the Warren Commission, this encounter was evidence of Oswald's cool, calculated demeanor. To critics, it raises confounding questions. How could Oswald have fired 3 shots, hidden the rifle, crossed the entire length of the 6th floor, and descended 4 flights of stairs in under 90 seconds without being out of breath or appearing flustered? Some employees at the depository testified to seeing Oswald in the second-floor lunchroom at around 12:15, just 15 minutes before the assassination, raising doubts about whether he had time to get to the sixth floor and set up. After the encounter, Oswald proceeded to the second-floor lunchroom. There, he bought a Coca-Cola from a vending machine and was sitting there calmly when a coworker, Mrs. Robert Reed, entered. She noted he seemed perfectly calm, not ruffled or upset. A few moments later, he walked out of the lunchroom, past Roy Truly's office, and casually exited the building through the front entrance onto Elm Street at approximately 12:33 p.m., just 3 minutes after killing the President of the United States. He melted into the chaos, a ghost slipping away from the scene. At 12:40 p.m., he boarded a city bus heading toward the residential neighborhood of Oak Cliff, where he had a room. However, the bus quickly got stuck in the traffic gridlock caused by the very assassination he had just committed. After only a few blocks, realizing the bus was moving too slowly, he asked for a transfer, got off, and walked several blocks to the Greyhound bus station. There, he hailed a taxi. He asked the driver, William Whaley, to take him to an address in the 500 block of North Beckley Street in Oak Cliff. During the roughly 15-minute ride, Oswald remained silent, betraying no sign of anxiety. Whaley would later remark on his passenger's unusual composure, finding it odd in a city that was by then descending into hysteria. At approximately 1 p.m., the exact moment Kennedy was being pronounced dead at Parkland Hospital, Oswald was dropped off a few blocks from his rooming house at 1026 North Beckley Avenue. He walked the final stretch, entering the small house at about 1:03 p.m. The housekeeper, Earlene Roberts, was surprised to see him, as he rarely came home in the middle of the day. According to her testimony, he went straight to his small room, stayed for only 3 or 4 minutes, and then left, zipping up a dark-colored jacket. Mrs. Roberts later told the Warren Commission she looked out the window and saw Oswald standing at a corner bus stop. At 1:15 p.m. in the 400 block of East 10th Street, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit was on his patrol route alone. Tippit was an 11-year veteran of the force, a husband and father of 3, respected by his colleagues. He had received orders from the police dispatcher to move into the central Oak Cliff area to look for a suspect described in a bulletin that had gone out shortly after the assassination. A white male, slender, weighing about 165 pounds, 5'10", in his early 30s. It was a description so vague it could have applied to thousands of men in Dallas, but it was all they had. As Tippit drove slowly down the street, he spotted a man walking in the opposite direction who seemed to fit that general description. The man was Lee Harvey Oswald, walking with his jacket zipped up. Tippit pulled his patrol car alongside Oswald and called him over. As he neared the front wheel, Oswald suddenly pulled out a revolver and fired several shots in rapid succession. 3 bullets struck Tippit in the chest and abdomen, sending him crashing to the pavement. Oswald then walked over to where the officer lay and fired 1 more shot into his head before turning and fleeing the scene. This brazen murder completely changed the nature of the manhunt. The search was no longer for a possible presidential assassin. It was now for a confirmed cop killer, a crime about which there was no ambiguity. The description of the shooter, along with his last known direction of flight, was immediately broadcast across the entire Dallas police radio network. After shooting Tippit, Oswald was a cornered man. He could hear the approaching sirens as dozens of police cars converged on the area. He ran several blocks, shedding his light-colored jacket and hiding it under a parked car. He ducked into the entrance of a shoe store to hide from passing patrol cars. The shoe store's manager, Johnny Brewer, saw him and thought his behavior was suspicious. A few minutes later, Brewer heard on the radio that a police officer had been shot nearby, and that the suspect's description matched the man he had just seen. He watched as Oswald left his hiding spot and slipped, without paying, into the nearby Texas Theater on Jefferson Boulevard. The movie playing was War is Hell. Brewer alerted the ticket seller and then ran to a nearby store and called the police. The massive manhunt now had a single point of focus. Within minutes, the theater was surrounded. Nearly 24 Dallas police officers, deputy sheriffs, and even FBI agents descended on the building. The house lights were turned on, interrupting the film. Police began to check each of the dozen or so patrons inside. Johnny Brewer, who had gone in with the police, pointed out Oswald, who was sitting near the back of the theater. As Officer Nick McDonald approached him, Oswald suddenly stood up and yelled a phrase that was later recounted in various ways by witnesses, but is most often quoted as, "Well, it is all over now," and punched the officer in the face. They dragged the struggling, shouting suspect out of the theater and into the bright afternoon sun, where a phalanx of police cars and a gathering crowd were waiting. As he was forced into a car, witnesses heard him screaming, "I'm not resisting arrest. Don't hit me anymore." And the phrase that would become his mantra, "I am a patsy. I am a patsy." At 2 p.m., roughly 90 minutes after the assassination of President Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin and confirmed killer of a police officer, was in custody. He was taken to Dallas Police Headquarters, a building that would serve as his final brief stage where his secrets, if he had any, would be silenced forever. The flight was over, but the truth remained a distant target. Into the vacuum of leadership and certainty created by 3 shots in Dallas and 1 in a police garage, Lyndon Baines Johnson stepped. Sworn in aboard Air Force One with Kennedy's body in the back of the plane, the new president understood that his most urgent task was not just to govern, but to heal. America had not just lost a leader, it was on the verge of losing faith in its own system. The murder of Oswald by Jack Ruby, broadcast live on television, transformed a tragedy into a nightmare of conspiracy theories. How could a civilian walk into a heavily guarded police garage and kill the world's most important suspect? Was it an act of incredible negligence or the final act of a plot to permanently silence the patsy? Rumors spread like wildfire, pointing to potential culprits from Fidel Castro to the CIA. Johnson feared that if the public came to believe the assassination was the work of a foreign power like Cuba or the Soviet Union, the calls for retaliation could escalate into a nuclear war. The stakes in his mind were apocalyptic. To quell the panic and put an end to the wild speculation, he needed answers, or at least the appearance of authoritative answers. He needed a definitive, irrefutable narrative that could calm a terrified public. And so just 1 week after the assassination on November 29, 1963, he signed Executive Order 11,130, creating the body that would be tasked with writing the official history of the crime of the century. It would be known as the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, but history would remember it by the name of its chairman, the Warren Commission. This is the story of how that official story was created, and how the very effort to provide closure ultimately created a mystery for the ages. The Commission's official mandate was simple: to ascertain, evaluate, and report upon the facts related to the assassination. Critics argue that there was an implicit goal to curtail speculation and reassure the public, though the Commission's official mandate focused on fact-finding. The Warren Commission faced a monumental task. Over the next 10 months, its members and their staff of bright young lawyers would sift through a mountain of information. They drew upon 25,000 interviews conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and 1,500 reports from the Secret Service. They took sworn testimony from 552 witnesses themselves, from Marina Oswald to Jacqueline Kennedy. The final report would be 888 pages long, with an additional 26 volumes of supporting material containing testimony and exhibits. On the surface, it was one of the most comprehensive and thorough investigations in history. Within hours of Oswald's arrest, Hoover was pushing the lone gunman theory. In a phone call shortly after Oswald was killed, he told a top White House aide, "The thing I am concerned about is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." He wasn't interested in an open investigation. He was interested in a conviction. Consequently, the thousands of pages of reports the FBI provided to the commission were all filtered through this predetermined conclusion. Declassified memos and critics suggest the FBI was quick to favor a lone gunman conclusion. Whether contradictory leads were sidelined remains a matter of debate. The Warren Commission's report was intended to be the final word on the assassination of President Kennedy. It was designed to reassure a shaken nation, to provide closure, and to engrave a single, indisputable truth into the annals of history. But it did the opposite. Instead of quelling the rumors, the report became their most potent catalyst. Its holes, contradictions, and improbable explanations created a credibility gap, a vacuum that was quickly filled by a growing army of citizen researchers, skeptical journalists, and lawyers who looked at the official story and saw not a fortress of truth, but a house of cards. They began to pull at the loose threads, and the whole tapestry began to unravel. What they uncovered was not a single alternative truth, but a labyrinth of shadows, a maze of interconnected possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. This is the story of that descent, an exploration of the great what-ifs that have haunted America for generations. This is the world of the conspiracy, a world born from the belief that a man as great as Kennedy could not have been brought down by a nobody like Oswald, but must have been felled by forces far greater and far darker. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was not just a crime against a man, it was a crime against an idea. It struck at the heart of American post-war optimism, shattered the nation's faith in its own institutions, and left a deep psychological wound from which the country has arguably never fully recovered. This final chapter is not about the suspects or the theories. It is about what was truly lost that day, about the enduring shadow the assassination cast over America, a shadow in which we all still live today. In one of the great ironies of American history, the tragedy in Dallas gave Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, the political capital to achieve what Kennedy himself had struggled to do. Johnson, a master legislator and one of the most formidable political figures of his generation, stepped into the power vacuum with a steely resolve. Harnessing the nation's immense wave of grief and constantly invoking the memory of the martyred president, he addressed Congress and the nation declaring, "Let us continue." And continue he did, spectacularly. Within a year, he used his legendary powers of persuasion to break a stubborn Southern filibuster in the Senate and pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most significant and far-reaching civil rights legislation in a century. He followed this with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which dismantled the legal barriers that had prevented African Americans from voting. Along with his ambitious Great Society programs, which created Medicare, Medicaid, and the War on Poverty, Johnson presided over a wave of legislation that fundamentally reshaped American society. All of it was done in the name of fulfilling the legacy of John F. Kennedy. In a sense, Kennedy's death gave birth to a more just America. The truth of his ultimate intentions was buried with him. What is certain is that the policy changed almost immediately after his death. Just 4 days after the assassination, on November 26, 1963, Johnson signed his own directive, NSAM 273. It was a subtle but decisive shift, authorizing planning for a much wider range of covert actions against North Vietnam. Kennedy's cautious skepticism was replaced by the hawkish determination of Johnson and the advisors he inherited. This culminated in the controversial Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, which gave the president a virtual blank check to wage war. The advisors Kennedy had planned to bring home were soon followed by hundreds of thousands of combat troops. The war would go on to claim the lives of over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. It would tear apart the fabric of American society, creating a bitter generational divide and a profound crisis of national identity. The political earthquake that began in Dealey Plaza had its longest and most devastating aftershock in the rice paddies and jungles of Southeast Asia. Beyond the specific policy consequences, the assassination triggered a profound and perhaps irreversible shift in the national mood. The buoyant optimism of the early 1960s, the Camelot spirit of youth and possibility, was extinguished. In its place grew a deep and persistent cynicism. The murder of the president, followed by the flawed and unconvincing report of the Warren Commission, shattered post-war America's faith in its own institutions. The government, the FBI, the CIA, the very entities meant to protect the nation, were now seen by millions as at best incompetent and at worst malevolent. The idea that the government could lie to its own people, once a taboo notion, became commonplace. This was the genesis of modern American conspiracy culture. The JFK assassination became the great foundational text for a new kind of civic engagement, one based on a deep suspicion of all official narratives. This loss of faith, this sense that the system was rigged and unseen forces were in control, fueled the anger and alienation of the counterculture movement and created the deep political polarization that continues to plague America to this day. Trust was lost, and it has never been fully regained. For many, Bobby Kennedy's death was the final conclusive proof that dark forces were at work in America, extinguishing any leader who dared to challenge the status quo. The hope for a restoration, for a return to the promise of the new frontier, died with him on the kitchen floor of the Ambassador Hotel. Public dissatisfaction with the Warren Report never faded. It simmered for decades, fueled by independent researchers. It finally erupted back into the national consciousness with Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK. Historically controversial, the film galvanized the outrage of a new generation and created an irresistible political pressure for transparency. The result was the John F. Kennedy Records Act of 1992, a remarkable piece of bipartisan legislation that mandated the release of all government records related to the assassination. The act established the Assassination Records Review Board, ARRB, an independent body that oversaw the declassification of millions of pages of documents through the 1990s. In the end, perhaps the search for the names of the gunmen is less important than understanding what was truly lost that day. It wasn't just a president. It was a certain kind of belief, a belief in progress, a belief in our institutions, a belief that in America the future would always be brighter than the past. The shots fired in Dealey Plaza inflicted a wound on the American psyche, and it is a wound that has never been allowed to heal. The questions, the doubts, and the dark possibilities continue to swirl, not because the evidence is weak, but because the crime was so immense. It was a crime against one man, but it felt like a crime against the future itself. The search for the truth of that day is, in the end, a search for something America lost in itself. And that is why, more than 60 years later, the echo of those shots has never truly faded.